Hello, everybody. My name is Aparna Bawa, and I am the Chief Legal Officer for Zoom. And I'll give you a little bit about this panel, a little background about how this came about. So we at Zoom are very, very proud of the fact that our technology is used to do so much good in the world. If you all hear Eric speak, you will hear this. If you read his shareholder letter in our S1, when we filed to go public, you will see that. We talk about how there are doctors, there are surgeons in the middle of critical surgery who are able to zoom into their peers and ask for feedback because of Zoom from faraway places while they're sitting there operating on someone. We heard about moms who are taking college classes who are able to zoom into their college class when they have to take care of a sick baby at home. So we hear all of this good stuff. And if you think about technology, most of what technologies claim to fame, on the good side anyway, is that we do a lot of good for society. That's the easy answer. So the panel here today is a group of customers. It consists of people just like you. And the question that we wanted to explore today was, do we as technologists or technology entrepreneurs, innovators, et cetera, have an obligation to do a little bit more? Can we just rest on the fact that our technology creates a lot of good? And what is our obligation to expand the pie for everybody, for the communities that we live in and the societies that we help foster? Now, I will say that this is an exploratory conversation for Zoom. We have not figured it out yet, I'll be perfectly honest. Sitting in the front row is my CFO, Kelly, and she is spearheading our sort of philanthropic efforts, and it's right now we're in conversation stage and listening stage. We obviously, we went public, and we have our headquarters a couple streets down from here in downtown San Jose, and we are a very large, prominent company in San Jose. Yet, the thing that troubles me the most is, right outside my door, when I go down to the parking garage, there are tent encampments. There are, suffering homeless people juxtaposed next to our fancy company with two big buildings, and taking advantage of the capital markets and making a lot of money for a lot of people. So this is that conversation, and on the stage with me, it's carefully thought out. These are people who represent our customers, just like you guys, from different verticals. So we have a VC firm, we have a nonprofit whose sole mission in life is to explore this conversation or this topic and attack inequities across multiple spectrums. We have a corporate law firm, disclosure, she also happens to be our corporate lawyer. So she knows Zoom, but she also comes from a firm that thinks about this quite a bit. And then we also have a member of the leadership and strategy group from one of our biggest customers, Uber. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we would love to start this discussion today with an introduction of yourself, what you do obviously, and what your personal and corporate stance is on this question. What is the obligation for corporations to promote, foster good in society, and what is your corporate view on that? So do you want to start, Santi?
Yeah, happy to kick it off. Thank you for joining us. I mean, this is a theme that is very dear and close to my heart. I'm originally from Argentina, so I didn't grow up here. My accent is not a fake accent. It's a real accent. And when I moved to California, trying to get into the venture capital ecosystem, a lot of the doors were shut for me because I didn't have that background. So even for me, coming here to California, a lot of people even said to me, you're Latino, this is not an industry for you, you should go try to do something else. And I kept on fighting, and eventually I got into venture, and I'm now with the firm Emergence Capital, and I've been with them for 10 years. And I've seen a lot of how these decisions are made, the allocation of capital towards entrepreneurs. And it's typically people allocating capital to people who look and talk and walk like them. So there's not a lot of push to expand the pie. Now we're starting to have that conversation. And for me, as an investor who can now make decisions in terms of how we allocate capital, I feel it's my responsibility as an individual and my responsibility as a leader at Emergence Capital to push for us to see no colors and see no geos when we are allocating capital. So I'm excited we're having this conversation, and I appreciate Zoom for making this an important topic and not just, oh yeah, we're going to talk about it in the S1 and then we're going to move on to generating more profits. I know that everyone in the organization is looking for ways to leverage technologies and to become an example for other companies to follow, because it is our responsibility.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Shwati. Well, I'm Suzanne St. John Crane, and I'm the CEO of American Leadership Forum Silicon Valley. And what ALF does, and has done for the last 30 years, is to connect and nurture high-level executives, cross-sector executives, and then assemble those folks in cross-sector networks for good. And so we've had 720 people in Silicon Valley who've been through from, religious leaders to tech founders and nonprofit CEOs that are together in a relationship through our Fellows program that lasts a year. And what we see out of that is that once we get people in those relationships together, new ideas emerge that make our future different from our past. And so no one sector can solve some of these, huge systemic issues and inequities. The nonprofit sector alone is not going to solve homelessness. The public sector is not going to solve homelessness. Tech is a huge resource, but they're not going to solve it either. We actually have to be together in community, humbly and with great curiosity and inquiry to be able to emerge solutions. So very glad to be having this conversation. And the one thing I will say, Aparna, is good news, it's actually not a pie. It's a garden, right? I want you to think of our region as a garden. And if anybody has done any gardening, you can't just put one ingredient in, because you're not going to have a fruitful garden, right? So it takes, for a healthy ecosystem, a lot of diversity in terms of the ingredients and the offerings and the opportunities. So,
thank you. So I'm Khalees Cheng. I am a partner at Cooley LLP in Palo Alto. I practice corporate law, and in fact worked with Aparna and Kelly and the rest of the team on the Zoom IPO. But why I'm part of this conversation. So I am a lawyer, but I didn't have any lawyers in my family. I never thought I would be a lawyer. I am a first generation lawyer in my family. I'm the first generation in my family to go to law school or grad school of any sort. So I think it's really important for us to realize that there's a lot of people out there who bring a lot of diverse viewpoints to the way we think about things and to the way we all work together. At our firm, it's, our CEO, Joe Conroy, has a personal mandate. Every year he kind of tells us his top 5 priorities for the year. And diversity and inclusion is always within that top 5. And it's important because we see the incoming classes of first-year associates. There's actually quite a diverse class. But as we see the classes move up, right, as people become more senior and people make partner, the diversity shrinks tremendously. And so it's really important for me, being a minority and a woman in my position, to be able to show the rest of the firm that it can be done, and to show the young associates that, hey, this is something that you can all do if this is what you want to do. And at the end of the day, it's critical to our bottom line to have diversity, because every client, every prospective client comes to us and says, hey, what does diversity look like at your firm? Who's going to be part of my team? You don't want to bring in a team of just white men, right? You need to bring in a team that shows the diversity of the firm, and those are the people who are going to be bringing their viewpoints to the particular transaction. So very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hi everyone. You have to excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I'll try my hardest to talk loudly. I'm Mina Harris. I'm the head of strategy and leadership at Uber. I lead our brand strategy on things like thought leadership and corporate responsibility, D&I, all the stuff that we're talking about. And I come to it with a perspective that's both, personal as well as corporate. I think on the corporate side, quickly, I agree that we all have this responsibility, right? We have incredible power and influence and wealth, and I think that it's on all of us to do our part, right? And Uber very much takes that position. We just launched a social impact team. D&I is core to our business and our priorities, not only because customers demand it, but also because we know it's good for our bottom line. But one thing, and I like, Suzanne, that you mentioned the garden, which is that I kind of reject this notion of a pie, because it suggests that there's a finite amount to share, right? And In my personal experience, and I'll tell a very quick story from, I'm a recovering lawyer, but from my early law firm days, learning that, when you make space for women, when you make space for underrepresented people in these industries, you're not just expanding power, but you're also enhancing your own power, and you're doing that for everyone, right? I was a young lawyer. I was on a very intense investigation. It was very high-level, confidential matter. Somehow I got invited to a meeting with all of the top partners in the law firm, and it was on like this high floor that I had never been. I was almost late. I showed up, and I got in the room, and there was this very small table, and all of the partners in the firm, and these Rainmaker partners, right, were sitting around the table. I was the only woman. And I walked in, and one of the youngest partners, and also the only partner of color, got up and gave me his seat. And to be clear, it would have been totally fine for me to sit in the back. Like, it was a big deal for me to be invited to this meeting in the first place. But that moment really showed to me, right, that he was not, it wasn't about giving up his seat, but it was signaling to everyone else that I deserved to be at that table, right? And that when he did that, it was showing that when you make space for people like me, we're enhancing everybody's power and everybody's contributions. So that's very much the perspective that I bring to our work, and very much the, I think, philosophy that Uber is leading with on things like social impact and D&I. So thank you also for coordinating this and inviting us to be here.
Great. So I'm going to make it a little controversial. I love controversy. So one of the things I personally struggle with is this idea that, Silicon Valley has a positive reputation, or I should say technology, because it's not just Silicon Valley, but technology has a positive reputation for doing a lot of good in the products that we develop and the innovation we drive. We also have a lot of negative feedback that we are selfish, and we just line our own pocketbooks, and the rest of the country or the world, we allow it to suffer. And some of the responses to that have been, but I cut big checks, and that's a method of solution. And I've also learned and been educated myself that just cutting big checks doesn't necessarily do it. It's also sort of figuring out who and how to cut that big check. Do I do it myself? And because it's, I think I'm better at doing everything myself, and I can create a better vehicle to deliver that good? Or do I go to established nonprofits or established avenues, even the federal government, if you will, to promote that opportunity? How do you guys react to that from the corporate standpoint, from the personal standpoint? What do you think is the best answer to that criticism? And do you have any suggestions for companies that are represented out here today who want to do the same thing, but are kind of caught between, I write a big check, but I don't really know how?
I could certainly take a
Sure.
stab at that. I mean, I think here's the good news, right? There are 88,000 millionaires and billionaires in Silicon Valley. 88,000. And 11,000 people are still considered homeless in the valley. 35% of people in Silicon Valley qualify for some sort of public assistance. And 90% of cash philanthropy leaves the region. So here's the good news, right? We have the resources. The resources are actually here. And thanks to experts who've been working on in these fields for a long time, whether it's poverty or homelessness or whatever, there are models that work. We're just not talking to each other, truly. I mean, that's part of what's holding us up from actually making progress on a lot of these areas. And I think what Destination Home and Chuck Robbins did around housing first and homelessness is a great example. When Chuck said to my colleague, Jennifer Loving at Destination Home, what do you need? And she said, I need $50 million, because what's not solving homelessness is we need more housing, right? And instead of going in and saying, well, let me give this to you, but I'm going to tell you how to spend it, the approach was, what do you need, right? What do you need? And how can our company be of service? And it ended up being a marketing team that she needed. It ended up being some connections in various sectors and his leadership. So the good news is the resources are here, right? And I think what I encourage anyone in this room to do who has the capacity and has the desire to really engage is get in the game, get in the conversation as a humble partner that is committed to community. We need you. We need you in the conversation.
What I would like to add to that is, I'm not going to advocate against like contributing and donating to all these causes. I think it's incredibly valuable. But the way I think about this is, we can do a lot more if everything we did, like work-wise or family-wise, had a component of this
Yeah.
giving back and getting involved. So I could cut a check and then feel that I'm done, I contributed, but that's not going to build an ecosystem of people who are involved. If, I don't know, my kids know that I'm cutting a check, and that's how I clean all my acts and say, oh, but I donated, then they're not going to grow up becoming the human beings that I want them to become. So I feel that it's our responsibility to do everything we do. So for me, if I'm an investor, I need to make sure that the companies that I invest in are thinking about this and are making a change, because that's where I can use what I have that's different from what you have, and what you guys have to create a change. So when we're looking at companies and investing in companies, we try to figure out if they're going to create a ripple effect, a positive ripple effect. And sometimes, and this is probably not great for me to say, but we'll pass on some investments that are going to generate a lot of returns without doing the right thing.
Right.
Our goal is to make a difference. And our own investors, our LPs, care about that as well. So I would encourage us to not just write checks, but get involved and try to do everything we do with this lens applied to it. And I mean, later on I'll give some examples of what we do, but I believe that we need to change the way we live our lives, and that's not just writing checks.
I would actually say don't do it later on. Why don't you give us some examples right now?
I'll give you an example.
If that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So Zoom, a great example. Before we invested in Zoom, full disclosure, we are investors in the company and happy customers. Before we invested in Zoom, most of our investments were here in Silicon Valley. And that's because that's where our network was. It was easy to drive up and down the peninsula, meeting with entrepreneurs, building those relationships and deploying capital, and then following up with these companies. Since we invested in Zoom, now 2/3 of our investments are outside of the Bay Area. And that's because of Zoom. So the technology that we love so much is helping us democratize access to capital and take it beyond our existing networks. And we should do that over and over again and find more technologies that are helping us solve the problems that we feel matter.
That's fantastic, because you know what? We at Zoom love to find these examples. It gives us some motivation to continue doing the jobs we do. I would love to say I am just motivated because, it's my paycheck, but it is not. It makes it a much better place to work, and it's so good for employees and your organizations to continue to get up every day, smile, drive in through a nasty commute, and then be happy during their daytime. I mean, we're talking about gratitude here. What else would you be thankful for? I mean, I know I'm thankful for that. I'm going to ask Mina, because I know, again, controversial. So we love Uber at Zoom. They are one of our original customers. They have a very big deployment, full disclosure. We also have seen them go through a lot of tumult. So it kind of would be a little bit, naive to say that we're just going to ignore that part. And I'm sure, Mina, you have seen a lot of change happen. I mean, based on Uber's historical perception, and I know you're working on so many efforts to improve diversity and inclusion within Uber. Would love to hear some examples of what you guys have done.
Yeah, I'm like, did I start this controversy with
No.
projecting the whole pie thing?
Not at all.
So as a former lawyer, I was drawn to Uber precisely because, we have had challenges. It's a tough problem to solve. I'm drawn to tough problems. And I think, building on this conversation around just responsibility and how do we think about deploying, some of these things and using our influence and power, I think there's sort of two sides to this, and I'll build on sort of the realities, right? That we are going through incredible change, as a lot of startups are. One is which that it's sort of about meeting people where they are. And I think that this even applies to this sort of general political context that we're in. I also do a lot of work with nonprofits, and almost every day I have people coming to me saying, what can I do? How can I be involved? And the reality is that we are all living busy lives. We are going to work. We are taking our kids to school. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to donate. And we see a lot of people doing that. And that's really great and really good. And we want to encourage that, right? But if you're asking me, how do you take it a step further? How are you more effective? And if you're willing to put the time in to do that, there's lots more ways that you can do it, such as partnering, right, with nonprofits, understanding that we are not the experts. I think Silicon Valley can do a lot more in the realm of knowing what we don't know, right? And understanding that we can be much more impactful and powerful if we amplify the work of other organizations. And so to that point, one of the things that we are doing at Uber is also saying that the pressure to do this doesn't have to only be on the people who are actually cutting the checks, like the CEO or me, right? We can engage our employees, and it's also, to your point, very good for employee engagement to say, we're going to launch a social impact team, and we're going to do a company-wide solicitation for organizations that you think should, get our money and be involved in this work. And then we're going to create an employee committee that's going to review all of the applications and give us your feedback on who you think is sort of deserving, right? So the point is that not only does that bring this diversity of perspective and experience and people to say, oh, I know that organization, I've done work with them, or to educate them about these organizations that are out there that they could be doing more with, but it's also about engaging our employees in this work, right? So I think we get stuck sort of in these this paradigm of, this has to come directly from the people who are cutting the checks, and if we don't exactly know, if we don't have these relationships, then we just sort of are not going to do it, and we're going to cut the check and walk away. I think in terms of the, kind of culture stuff, right? It's the same thing, right? It's not just about top down. It's about looking at actually the fact that this is the changes in practices and policies will mean nothing if we don't actually have the culture change, and we need to engage our employees in doing that, and it's a company-wide effort. There's sort of too much, and it's too complicated, I think, to answer in just that one question.
That's okay.
On this topic, but
I thought it was a great answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to shift over to my friend Khalees, and again, I'm going to set this problem up a little bit. I don't know how many of you are lawyers, probably not a lot in this room. I am, so is Khalees. As we know, Mina's a recovering lawyer, but if you started your career in a law firm, you know that the mandate of the law firm is a little bit different than sort of even your technology company, whether startup or not. So most law firms are fancy partnerships, and they kind of eat what they kill. You have some people who are worker bees and do the work, but really it's not, it's not designed theoretically to sort of, I should say, build a garden as opposed to expand the pie. But somehow, Cooley, there are a few law firms in the Valley, and I would say Cooley is one of them, and I'll put a plug out there for Fenwick as well. Not to say that the others aren't, but I have noticed initiatives, even small things like, this is probably the third company that I've helped to take public as a general counsel. And in one of my companies, I realized that I was just, everybody that was getting put in front of me was about to make partner. And there was a reason, because I'm very opinionated, and I will go share that feedback. And if they put a good person that was about to make partner, and I shared the feedback with the firm, guess what? That person made partner. So I thought this was very thoughtful. I loved it. I was a little manipulated, but that was okay. Because they thought through, let me strategically place minorities, women, disadvantaged folks who wouldn't have otherwise gotten that opportunity in front of this person who's very loud and will go share the feedback. And that's how we get it done. So with that, I would love to hear your perspective. Khalees, you live and work in a very traditional sort of lockstep environment, but you guys are, bucking the trend a little bit. I would love to hear about some of the things that you're doing.
Yeah, actually one of the things that attracted me to Cooley, so I've only been at Cooley for 2 years. I was at another firm for many years before that, but coming to Cooley and learning about its culture it was an eye-opening experience, because I'm used to exactly what Aparna was saying. Everything's lockstep. It's eat what you kill. So if you are the one with the relationship with the client, you hang on to that for dear life, right? Because you don't want to share it with anyone else. Cooley is very different because, one, we don't talk about originating credit. We don't talk about who brought the client in. It's when we do our partner compensation memo at the end of the year, there are 5 questions that were asked, and 2 of the questions are, who have you helped this year, and who's helped you? Because at the end of the day, what the firm cares about is how are you collaborating with others within the firm? And that's what it values. And it wants to, so, by looking at these memos, you're kind of corroborating with each other, right? Like, oh yeah, this person said they helped them. And in every interaction, there is a give and receive, right? If I bring somebody into my client to help with a particular situation, that person can say, oh, well, Khalees helped me involve me in this client. And I would say, oh, well, this person was great because she helped me with my client, right? My client needed a particular set of expertise and that person provided it. So that is just, one thing that Cooley does very differently, and it thinks about it differently, and that, I really appreciate that. And to Aparna's point earlier, putting the right people in front of a client, we do that very strategically. I mean, we want to know who the client is, who we're going to be meeting, and then we think, okay, who within the firm would be the right team to put in front of this client? Because again, there's no credit. We don't have to worry about that. So what we care about is what's best for this client. We want to make sure that the personality fit works well, right? Because like in an IPO, we spend a lot of time together. So we want to make sure that we're actually, putting the right person in front of the client who will actually be able to work with them closely. And also thinking about, okay, do we have the right expertise, the right level, and just the right people, the right combination of people for this particular team?
So let me follow up on that a little bit, because I think part of the challenge is defining the right people, defining who those people are. And historically, it's not a surprise, but to Santi's point, if you looked a certain way and talked a certain way and acted a certain way, you would be counted in that right bucket. And in my mind, from what I'm hearing from all of you, is the definition of the right person is changing. It's changing, and it's probably for the good. It's giving more opportunity to other folks. So, if any of you guys can talk about, how you think about that and how you see in your firms that definition of the right person to put in front of the client is changing, I would love to hear it.
I would say that it is and it isn't. And I want to ask you a question,
Okay.
which is, I'm very much just in my lawyer mode here, which is I experienced a number of times at my firm, my former firm, where internally we knew that it was, it happened to be the smartest person that was going to be put on, as to serve the client was going to be a woman of color or someone else who's underrepresented. But the client said, oh, I don't want that young person on my case. I don't want that junior associate on this case. It's too sensitive. So, I think this is maybe particular to, the client relationship in a law firm, but I'm curious where you may have the right intentions, right? Mm-hmm. But there's other external factors that are, and again, this can apply, I guess, to all of us, which are maybe the external factors are your bottom line, right? Like that's often also one of the arguments that's made. So I'm just curious if you've experienced that and how you deal with it.
We have, and at the end of the day, the customer is always right. So we want to make sure that the client gets what they want. But what we really do encourage is getting to meet the person, right? Zoom is actually really helpful because when you're actually on the video conference, you can see the person, and it's a lot. I think it's different when you actually build a relationship and have a conversation with a person face to face or over Zoom than it is to hear, oh, well, I'm going to put a first year on your team, and this person just graduated from law school last year, right? Like seeing the person, talking to that person, and hearing what they have to say, I think will change some perspectives about, is that person really the right fit for this team, or, do I see an opportunity to help this person become the person that they need to be in order to be the right fit?
I think, Mina, also as someone who chooses vendors myself, I think there's an element of risk. And so I'm sure all the IT heads in the room here have heard the phrase when they were growing up in their career, you don't get fired for picking Big Blue. It's maybe several years ago, but that's what, my dad used to joke about it because he worked for IBM Global Services when I was growing up. So he used to be, you never get fired for picking Big Blue. And I've always taken that notion with me, except that I think it's changing. I mean, who we count as Big Blue is sort of changing. The very fact that Zoom has been able to do so much. I met the first customer of Zoom yesterday University of Iowa, who basically saw a prototype and met Eric and Nick Chong, if anybody knows them, and said, this is revolutionary, it's going to change the world. And then he proceeded to have all these people tell him that this was a bad idea and that we were not tested, not proven, etc. So there's definitely an element of risk. I'm not saying that you can just do it willy-nilly, because your job's on the line too. But you have to pressure test it, sort of do your diligence, etc. I will say, though, that for us at Zoom, we actively take those risks. So for example, even our IPO, sort of, I can only speak to our legal team, but even our IPO team that supported us from a vendor side, we actively went for people who we knew were good. We knew did all the work, but maybe didn't have the gray hair to be the name partner on the firm. And we said, we're going to take a risk, and nope, we're not going to take the next person. We're going to stop there, because we know that we want to give them a chance. I will tell you that my board, Santi's on my board, so it's a bit disclosure, did say, that's fine and dandy, but if shit hits the fan, make sure you have an exit route. So we did have that conversation where, do you have someone who can come and help us if shit hits the fan? And yes, we did, but it never did. Everything was fine. So in some ways, you have to kind of have a risk mitigation plan, but at the same time, you kind of have to take a risk, because we wouldn't be innovating and we wouldn't be picking these new products if we didn't take a risk. If people didn't take a risk on Eric and Nick back in 2013, we would not be here today talking about this topic. Yeah. So that's something I definitely want to be cognizant of.
And I mean, to follow up on that, if you see success that comes after you take a risk, then people are more encouraged to take risks. And if you see how diversity pays off, because a lot of people say, oh, diverse team are better, and you need to have this special combination, but a lot of people don't see the results. And I'll give you another example. So we ended up investing in Zoom early on because I have a need that a lot of people didn't have. And my need was, I wanted to talk to my friends and family in Argentina. So when I talked to other people and said, oh, Zoom is much better, it's like, yeah, I don't need Zoom. My phone is fine, my other products work fine. It's like, no, they don't work fine when you expand it. So now at Emergence, we see the advantages of having people with different backgrounds. And now we're using technology like Zoom. We have another company called Textio that helps with recruiting. It removes the biases from recruiting. Or Clearbank, funding companies based on data. What we notice is when you remove those biases, you end up funding 8 times more female founders than if you were just talking to them. And that's amazing when that happens.
And we all have those biases, right? We all have them. I mean, it's interesting. One of our senior fellows from last year, who is she's a consultant, does M&A and work, and she was asked. She's an African American woman, and she said, I go into these environments, and I was asked, I think it was at Cisco, to hire a team for X project. She was, at the end of the day, I looked at the team I hired, and they were all white men. This is an African-American woman, right? And so she told this story at a Berkshire Hathaway conference and the session was on diversity. And she says, so even I have these, what's my comfort zone? What's my, And I think one of the biggest assets we have in this region is our diversity of thinking, our diversity of perspectives. That makes for a creative environment, creative possibilities, right? And I think that's part of the reason that in our fellows program, for instance, I mean, we're just so committed to half private sector, half nonprofit public. We always reserve a spot for a religious leader and a labor leader. I mean, we create this microcosm of community and connections that emerges really interesting solutions. Can I just...
Oh, sorry.
And I just want to add one quick thing, because I don't want to lose this story. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you to the Zoom team for actually having the courageous conversation about what we can do with the position that you're in, right? So Susan Packard, or David Packard's daughter, is a senior fellow in our program, and I get to meet with her frequently. And she tells the story of how when her father was building HP, the city of Palo Alto said, you need to build housing with this. And he thought, I need to build housing? What is this? That's not my responsibility. This conversation in this valley has been going on for decades. Whose responsibility is it And I guess I would argue it's our collective responsibility because we're creating and building community together. So what does that look like? To your point, it can look like a check. It can look like a variety of things. And what it looked like for David Packard is while he was CEO of HP, he served on the school board in Palo Alto. How many CEOs in Silicon Valley are doing that today, right? So I would just challenge you to think about what are the unique ways you can get in the game, and let's stop having this conversation in another 40 years. Can we please? Let's fix some stuff.
Sounds good. Did you want to say
I was
something?
going to say, I think what is key is what you said around it's an active commitment, right? And sometimes that's having tough conversations. I think it's also recognizing that this is a systemic problem, right? I think we focus so much on the data in tech, right? How, like, diversity reports, okay, how many white men do you have? Like, that's all the press cares about, right? But the point is this happens sometimes over generations in terms of really, breaking down these systems. And so in your case, maybe that means that you've identified that this can be a problematic dynamic with clients where they're able to dictate a team that ends up being all white men. And you say, okay, how do we solve that, right? Maybe it's relying on technology like Zoom and understanding that that enables us to have a different sort of conversation that influences them to make a different decision. But the point is that it is systemic, and we need to come up with ways to change the systems and not just sort of accept, right, what is presented to us. Otherwise, it will be the same.
Well, thank you. And so it's with great gratitude that I thank our panel. We have 8 minutes left. I would love to take any questions. If anybody has any, we can keep talking. We're good. But if anybody has any questions, we have someone with a mic who can definitely take it. One in the back, right there.
Can't see.
Thank you so much for putting this on, and I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. One thing I like what you said was the analogy behind the table, being part of that table, and I look at the landscape, and when you're seeing, yes, predominantly it's white males that dominate a certain field, but then let's look at the root of it, and it's maybe having to do more with education versus and the opportunities available for kids in the inner city and whatnot. So what can companies do to attack the root of that problem, which is providing more opportunities to the kids, which are the future, versus trying to fix a house with a broken foundation, but starting at the windows. The foundation is still broken. The house is still going to fall down if the foundation isn't fixed. So more women of color, more men of color, more minorities having the same opportunities to learn, to be competitive in a very competitive environment. I mean, how can we do a better job at making sure that we take steps to make that a possibility in the near future?
I can take a crack at that. I tend to be an optimist in my entire life. However, on this front, I think it's going to take time. I don't think there's like a silver bullet that's going to help us fix this in a year or two. I'll give you one example. I joined Emergence 10 years ago, and 80% of the entrepreneurs that I backed are foreign born. And that's how you start creating this ripple effect. You start bringing in more people into leadership, influential roles, and those people are going to create a ripple effect and are going to bring in more diversity into the workplace. In order to start that process, as a company, as a group, as a family, you need to be very intentional, very deliberate, and get out of your comfort zone. But once you get it started, it's amazing how it trickles down through the entire organization.
Fair hair.
I'll also answer that question.
What?
I don't know if you can hear me.
I don't think so.
The mic over here isn't working.
I'll just take I'll take this one. I'll also answer that question. So I struggle with this a lot. I live in Saratoga, and I work in downtown San Jose. Pretty fancy areas, if you ask me. And what I realized, so I'm on a board of a nonprofit called Fly, very low-key organization. Doesn't have galas, it's not very fancy. And basically the tenet of the organization is to intercept youth in my backyard, in Santa Clara, San Mateo, Alameda counties, intercept youth who are right about to go into probation because they have a tremendous propensity for mischief. And they work with sort of the social workers, the probation department, the judges in the juvenile courts, et cetera. And the premise originally was, it costs about $250,000 to incarcerate a teenager, 8 to 12, 13 years old, or 14 years old in Santa Clara Juvie Hall, but it costs, $5,000 to put them through this organization's program, which basically sort of takes these youth and does some data analysis to say, are they ready for change, or they want to make a better life, and then puts them through this intensive program, which I can go to details about it later. The reason I'm saying this is, your question struck me personally. Now, I will be perfectly honest. I'm on the board. I give money and I raise money. I can do a lot more. There are a lot more opportunities to do. You can do sort of mentoring. They have a law program where they actually go into local schools and they do classes for these kids. Like, you're in that program, so the judge says, instead of putting you in juvie hall, I'm going to make you go to this class. The kid rolls his eyes at you, but has to go, otherwise he's going to juvenile hall. And where they basically teach you, like, it's illegal to drive without your license. You can't really smoke pot, ever in certain areas, and maybe sometimes in certain areas, and definitely not when you're under the age. So things like that, they just teach you, and they're lawyers, and there are lots of lawyers who volunteer. But what I will say is, you find a way to contribute in the way that you can at that point in time. I love what Mina said, meet people where they are. There are multiple opportunities, and there are multiple opportunities in our own backyards. And that's what really struck me. Wasn't donating to India, where I'm from. This was in my backyard. Yep. And it's been an amazing experience.
I would add, how many of our companies have thriving internship programs where you are not getting the usual suspects? We have a colleague who was talking about, how do we get more people into the financial services or investment arena? We seem to keep getting the same types of people. And my response was, well, where are you looking, right? I just came from a meeting where a woman, lovely lady who's an executive director, said, we need more diverse board members. I look at the board, it's pretty much all white guys, men and women, and I said, well, where are you looking, right? We need to get outside of our bubbles, and I think we need to encourage our HR departments too, to start thinking about how do we partner with community to create a pipeline that's in our backyard so that people of color and in disadvantaged areas get a seat at the table, because that's to our benefit, it's to our community's benefit. So HR departments and company culture is a big deal.
I have the mic, but if anybody else has questions,
Another one.
Please ask. Oh, we have a question, a gentleman over here.
So I believe, Cleese, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wonder if the rest of the panel could share, what are some of the things that you're doing internally with your employees to foster a stronger culture of diversity and inclusion and community outreach?
I'll go really quickly. We have a lot of stuff that we're doing. I think it starts with the basics, right? Like unconscious bias training, allyship training. I think it also kind of building on the theme of meeting people where they are is just having these conversations. These conversations are difficult for folks who may not be engaging in this often. So acknowledging that there needs to be a discussion and to talk about it candidly and honestly, right? Talking about things like intersectionality, which is that there are experiences that women and women of color and other underrepresented groups have in the workplace that are distinct and different from other people, right? You asked about sort of community engagement, which I think this is overlapping, but it is a little bit separate. So as I mentioned, we have just rolled out a social impact team and are not only using that team to do this work, but are looking at it more strategically and integrating it into the rest of our employee engagement strategies to say, how can we actually bring our employees into this process? Which again is not just for the good of the work, but it's also good for employee morale, right? And for people to feel like they're actually doing something in a company that cares about these things. So those are just sort of some basic things that we're doing. But again, I think the overall point is that this is not something that you can sort of fixed in one program or one training, or right. I think in tech we have this mentality of approaching things like a product launch, right? You have these steps, you put it out in the marketplace, you figure out how people react to it, you iterate, and like this is just a totally different paradigm. And I think that is what's very challenging for us to adjust our perspective and understand that we may not have that immediate gratification, right? That this stuff takes a long time. It's hard, it's uncomfortable oftentimes. And so being honest about that too, I think is really important to make sure that we're actually being effective in these processes.
Yep.
I'll also add, I think it takes an attitude, a mind shift a little bit. Even if you're not the head of your company, if you're head of your group, I would say having an open mind to things that you're not used to. I work for Eric, and what I love about him is I am able to go into him and say, I disagree with you on this, and this is why. And, Suzanne, you were saying we're having a courageous conversation. I feel like Kelly and I have courageous conversations with Eric all day long because he fosters an attitude that you can. He doesn't take it personally. He doesn't get sensitive. And we walk out of the room, just singing Kumbaya and we love you. No problem. I love you, Aparna. I love you, Eric. It's no problem. I think if you are a leader and if you can foster that environment and if you can really listen, that's step one.
Yep.
That is really step one.
Hear, hear.
That's probably why we are having those courageous conversations here today.
Great video by Jay Smooth, if you haven't seen it. It's about why it's so hard to talk about race and equity and racism. And he uses this great analogy. He says, this sort of training and cultural diversity training, it's not a box that you check. It's not like a sexual harassment training. Oop, check, okay, I'm good, I'm cleared to go. It's kind of like flossing. And so we need to be able to say to each other, hey, you have a little racism in your teeth, right? Because it's a little bit of something that we have to do every day and be conscious and aware of it. So I would encourage you to take a look at that video even as a tool for your employees to kind of break the ice. But I would agree wholeheartedly as somebody that facilitates these conversations with executives across the board that you have to have a safe place to have these talks. You have to make that available to your people.
So we're a little bit over our time. If anybody has any follow-up questions, I would love to take them. You just met that panel and we're on the app, so you can even ping them later. And I'm shameless. I'll give you their email too, no problem. Thank you so much. It's with great gratitude that we have you guys here today. Thank you for being customers and supporters and partners of Zoom. As our motto is happiness for all, and we love you all. And thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you guys.